Hello, I want to welcome everyone to our RMM Tech series. Our feature focus today is going to be maximizing SNMP. My name is David Ionetta. I'm a sales engineer for SolarWinds MSP, and today I'm joined by Ernest Bird, who will be doing our live demo, and Robert Meehan, another member of our sales engineer staff, who will be taking your chat questions this morning. So a little housekeeping before we get started. Will we be recording? Yes, we will. How about Q&A? Again, we're going to do ongoing Q&A with our Robert Meehan, and also live answers at the end as time allows. And any long answers we can address with a follow-up call or email. So if you have a question, just submit your questions and comments through the webinar window, and Robert Meehan will type away feverishly as fast as he can to get as many of your questions as possible during the time allowed. So let's talk today about maximizing SNMP. Okay, for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about first, let's get on the same page and talk about what exactly is SNMP. And second, how do we prepare a device for SNMP? And finally, adding an SNMP request into the RM dashboard. So let's get at the beginning. It's great to get a lot of our terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page, talking the same language. So what are we talking about with SNMP? Basically, just to say from the beginning what exactly SNMP is SNMP essentially is a device will write information and about its status and so forth to a public folder. That information is then retrievable by any number of means. And SNMP stands for Simple Network Management Protocol. It's used in network management systems in order to manage the devices. So that's exactly what it is. The information essentially is there for the mining. So we're going to talk a little bit about that process. Of course, it's going to be using a community string. So what that is, this is effectively a password sent from every packet that's transmitted between the SNMP manager and the SNMP agent or device, which is clear text and will need to be matched by the application. Basically, devices will record the information about themselves in that specific location on the device. So another term you may hear is a MIB or MIB. That is a management information base. It's basically a file that's constructed in a tree structure, and each branch of the tree is separated by a period like the directories and subdirectories. This is essentially a map to the information. Another one you may hear is OID, an object identifier. It's a numerical string, and it's used to uniquely identify an object in a noticeable as the leaves found in the MIB tree structure. And finally, SNMP agent. This generates the OID on the device in relation to the supported MIB files. Take note that the advanced monitoring agent queries this SNMP traffic. We don't create the OIDs. So now let's talk a little bit about preparing a device for SNMP, some of the things to look for. First, in order for the management station to be able to properly discover and manage devices, the following things might need to be met. The device, of course, needs to support SNMP and be enabled. The SNMP device is installed and running. Please note that we only support the SNMP GET request. We do not support SNMP traps. Then the community string sent into the scan matches the community string on the device. So you have to have a match up there. Make sure that everything's in order. The default string for ready is usually public. And the device is accessible from the machine you're adding the SNMP check from. That's another piece. You have to be on basically, when we're looking at our agents, the agent has to be able to see that device. It has to be on the same subnet. So, getting into the meat and bones of this, now that we've covered some of our basic terminologies, let's go ahead and look at SNMP dashboard check. And that's where we're going to go into a live demo with Ernest. Ernest is another member of our sales engineer team. He's very knowledgeable on this subject. So get your pens handy and get ready to learn a lot in the dashboard. So over to you, Ernest.
All right, thank you, David. Hope everyone's doing well today. Let's go ahead and jump right into the dashboard, talk about SNMP, and also talk about how that can be used to this system to actually monitor your routers, your printers, your switches, the network appliances, even monitoring RAID against a given target. First, here I have one of my agents selected, and I'm going to show how to add an SNMP check against the system. This SNMP check will allow me to monitor my remote targets, ones that are not capable of an agent, by simply selecting the Add Check. I'm going to have access to a repository. We have roughly 750 object identifiers across about 36 different vendors. These are all the built-ins that are given to us from vendor. So they're specified to have given accepted values, ones that define normal operation, and also ones that allow you to understand if it's a device behaving unexpectedly. And this, you could, for example, go in and monitor a RAID structure against a localized target. If you wanted to monitor the individual disk of a Dell system here, you're able to do so. You'll see in the drop-down the selection for the given check. And what that will do is populate the object identifier. The object identifier is going to be the entry point for the value information relative to some sort of descriptor. That descriptor is resolved with the value off of the appliance due to the lack of hardware resources that are necessary to give that information locally. So think of this information providing altogether a collective what would be like a Windows event log. In a Windows event log, you're going to have details around the description, the value information, the event log ID, but a lot more of that's together in that view because more hardware resources are available to the system to provide that. So through this, what you're doing is you're providing a query to a given target, which you can define in here. If it is RAID, for example, it would be a local host query. If it is a remote target, maybe an IP address that you put in here. Typically, you're going to use the IP or FQDN, which is fully qualified domain name. However, I do often recommend using IP if it's a static IP. And that just removes any additional layers. And you would have the communicating port. This is going to be a UDP request that goes out to the target using this security profile or community string, and then would have ability for versions 1 and 2C to be able to communicate with those object identifier values. In a given scenario where, let's say, one of the expected values are not seen in here, or the expected vendor is not in the list, and you want to add a new object identifier for monitoring, what you can do is you can come into Settings, and under Settings you're going to see Predefined SNMP Checks. This is where you can go in and think of this as uploading or plugging in your custom object identifiers. So maybe you have a new appliance that you know has SNMP GET request communication. Remember, the GET request is what we offer through this platform. That is a bidirectional communication, more a query versus a trap, which is going to be offloaded from the appliance and has a greater risk of failure, because if the collecting appliance is not online, you lose that data. So the GET request is capable in the system. You've enabled it. Then what you can do is to then go to New. You would put in the vendor, and this will just put in test, monitored product, test router. And this is just to give an example. Typically you would gather this information from the provider. So this would be through a MIB dictionary maybe that they give you the object identifier. Or maybe you even find it out on a forum and you validate it through a MIB-walk utility, which we'll be speaking of here shortly. The object description or object identifier description. This is just, what does this number even mean? On this, maybe we want to look at uptime. And the object identifier is going to have a given structural sequence. And these are just different entry points into that MIB structure. So it's going to have a general class structure. It's kind of like the animal kingdom. You have your different tiers as you're working down through these octets, and that all means something. Some of these may be even available through the default MIB structures, the version 1 and 2C or version 1 and 2 libraries. From there, you may see that in the MIB-walk and just import it in here. Of course, if you have the vendor as a resource, validate the information. And the operator, what that does is allows you to understand what the expected value is or expected range. And when it's outside of that expected range, it's going to give you a failure to let you know that device is behaving abnormally. In this, if you want to set an expected range greater than a given value, you can set it. Maybe you want to look at uptime, so you want to say, I want to be up greater than 15 minutes. Then you could put in, assuming this is reported from the device in minutes, 15. Maybe it's reported in seconds or milliseconds. I had a DDWRT system I was uploading and found that it was reported in 1/100th of a second. So in a given scenario like that, I put in 90,000, so I could say I'm expecting greater than 15 minutes. If it's less than, that means the devices went offline, someone's obtained access, powered it down, and by that, I want to be notified. I want to have an alert. So from this, I could just click Save, and that would allow me to have that in my library for then assignment. So if I were to come back and go to the SNMP Check, you're going to find in my library now the test entry, and it's going to show my test router uptime to be able to inject that information in here. From this, I could put in the IP address of the target. Additionally, what you'll find is this product field, this is a text-based field. And what I often recommend doing is typing something meaningful in here. So if you know this router is given an IP, static IP, put it with the IP information. And what this does is when the alert comes through, it gives something meaningful and you know how to quickly identify the system and respond to it versus just knowing it's associated with the monitoring server. Maybe location information. And this is so when the ticket is open through your ticketing system even, that information is fed directly to the technician responding, and you don't have the additional communication factors. Where do I locate this system and so forth. So with this, you could go ahead and click OK. And what you're going to find is when you assign the given monitor at the system, it's going to do an immediate synchronization. Once you have that synchronization, then the details would show into here should the communication be intact. Now this was a given test example. I know that's not a legitimate IP on my network, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this check. What we're going to look at next is configuring a target to accept the request. There's a couple different scenarios where you're going in and doing monitoring. It could be for RAID, as I was mentioning earlier. It could be against a network appliance. Since I have access to a given NAS device, a TerraStation system, I'm going to go into that interface and first show you how that can be configured to accept the GET request. Of course, when you purchase a device, you want to validate for this type monitoring that it does support the SNMP GET request. Some lower-end network appliances may support traps only, and again, there's a greater risk of losing that information set when you're using the traps, and therefore we don't support that. So you want to look at a device that supports a GET request. That allows you to then query and pull that information from the cache of the system. I'm going to pull up the interface for the Buffalo TerraStation, and under the network tab, what you're going to find is there's SNMP. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to relog into this first. And I'm going to jump over to that SNMP tab under the Networks tab. This, by default, would not be enabled for the GET request. And what I would need to do is enable that, set up an accepted community string. That community string, again, is that security profile. How do I authenticate against the system? So I can modify the settings, and I would enable this. I would set a community string. Now, for this given example, I have public, and that may be a default suggestion. Typically, you're going to want to put something more unique in here. That way, you're not using something standard that could potentially be compromised if someone were to obtain access to your network. Do keep in mind there is security around just SNMP GET request in itself, and that's a LAN-based protocol, but as a good security measure, you want to put something unique in your community name. So only you know the authentication mechanism. This is the password, if you would, to the system. So if you were to enable this, set up your community string, that information you want to note, so when you're adding the monitor out, you can, within the dashboard, input that credential set and have the authentication to the system to obtain value details. Once you're done, you could click Save, and that would allow for the commit. Some devices may require restart, some require other factors. This is a simple NAS appliance. Router, for example, may require a little bit more in configuration. Cisco may require some terminal modification in order to enable that, and the vendor should be able to give you documentation on how to do that if the device supports the details. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you how to communicate through a mid-walk utility and talking with that given target. So again, as I've noted in the example, I have the Buffalo Terra Station, the public community string in use, which is what I've set up in this mid-browser utility to communicate with, and I'm going against the set address. In this, I'm just going to do a simple walk. Now, different mid-walk utilities may have different navigational procedures, but in general, you're going to be able to do GET requests, you're going to be able to do walks. The GET request is going to allow you to pull value information from one entry point. A walk is going to do a full enumeration of the system. So there's a few differences in this. What I have now loaded are the standard default 1 and 2 libraries. This is where I'm navigating and looking for details against the system. And I'll show you in a moment how to even do within this utility. This is our reasoning mid-browser utility, but there's other ones out there like GetIf, for example, or even some other ones that you may have purchased. But this allows you to interact with that and kind of simulate what you're going to be doing through the dashboard. So if you're going to set up a server agent to monitor these given select targets, you may want to put the mid-walk utility on that just to go ahead and walk the process before you add out the monitors, allowing for something more interactive. We'll even be looking at, in just a few minutes, the agent login and doing the checks from within there to show you a more timely communication. First, though, we'll just go ahead and do a walk, and this is just doing a full enumeration of the device, seeing which details resolve. This may take a few minutes, but some of the things that you'll see in here are the given descriptor. What is that system? This one, the Buffalo Terra Station, so that's my sysdescript. This is, if I double click it, going to populate here the object identifier of focus into this view. So I could copy that and put that directly into my dashboard for monitoring should I not have that built in. If I want to understand the name of the system, I could double click that and that'll bring its own object identifier. Things, connection variables, for example. I could pull that detail set. Some of these may be intuitive with a name or object identifier. Some may be less than. So that's something to consider. Always go for documentation if you have it first. If you were to want to take that information to then monitor, what you could do is change this to a GET operation. So let's say I want to clear this table here and I want to start with an object identifier. I'm going to change my operation to GET after I put in the object identifier of focus, and that'll give me the ability to then query to that entry point. So it doesn't look like I copied the right one out. Let's jump back over to the descriptor here. So I did receive that with a double-click operation. It does that GET, and I have the value information as Buffalo Terra Station. So if I were to upload that, that would be my output. In fact, we'll go through that real fast now. I'm going to jump back over to my dashboard, and under the predefined SNMP checks, I'm going to look for Buffalo. So I'm not seeing it in the list. Let me go ahead and do a new ad. Now I do know I have this in the library elsewhere. It just doesn't show my custom definitions, but this is going to be a good test as well. So I'm looking for this object identifier, I'm going to set it description as system info. I might just leave it at 0 because I'm doing text-based resolve versus an operating range that I'm looking for, and being at string output, that should be sufficient just to give me the details. So I'm going to go ahead and save this now and close. And against my system, I'm going to add the monitor. I'm going to add the 24/7 SNMP check. I'm going to choose in this Buffalo versus the one that was built in system info. And the target, I need to make sure I'm putting in the right IP. Public, we'll leave the defaults here, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now that's going to synchronize with the system and then pull back the information. If I ever want to expedite that, and it should be a very timely process, but to expedite this, you can just run the checks again. Keep in mind the run checks on a system will do a rerun of your 24/7 and your daily safety check items. So everything in this checks view would be rerun. With that, I should have in just a moment the details. You'll see Buffalo Terra Station. So pull back that in a very timely fashion. We'll look at how to do that at the device level. I'm going to jump back over. Before I get out of the walk utility within my test machine, what I want to do is show you how to import a MIB. So maybe you pull a MIB structure down from a given vendor and you want to see the different entry points for that. You don't know the given octet series, the object identifier to look at, but just by loading a MIB, you could go through and retrieve that information through walking the interface in a more interactive fashion. So on my test system, I just had a MIB stored on my desktop. Go ahead and open that up, and you'll see in the tree it's just going to add a little more details. So if I were to go in and remove this, what you're going to see is the trees looking a little bit different back under the standard dictionaries. Again, the reload. And this just allows me to see the standard dictionaries as well as the ones that may be more unique for a given vendor. Let me go ahead and jump out of this now. And one of the things that we had talked about was going into an agent, doing something more interactive. So when you install an agent on a system, you're going to have the localized advanced monitoring agent. What you can do is you can log into this. In most scenarios, you're not going to be adding the checks within here. We do in our help file suggest that you do the bandwidth monitoring checks from within here. That's so you ensure you have the appropriate internal port name, and the bandwidth monitor uses SNMP GET request communication as well. It just takes and computes that over a given interval so you have the right information for your threshold. And so it uses your if and if out octet streams to be able to compute that. Right now we're going to look at the 24/7 checks, so we can go under settings, and this is where I can do something more interactive. I go to configure checks, and right now I'm just communicating to that device through the agent, much like the dashboard would. So you can see the built-ins here with the IPs of communication, but if I wanted to add, what it gives me access to is the repository that I see in the dashboard. So I could do that same add in here, and by adding it, I can then do a test check. What you're going to see is this one should fail. That's the one I just added, and you can guess why. It's because I didn't change the IP. I didn't put the appropriate target. In this one, I can do a test check, and I can see the details around that check. If I want to look at other variables, I can test and do that interactive view from the device level. If I wanted to do the bandwidth check, which uses the SNMP GET request, I can come in here, I can put in the description, can put in the target IP, and what this allows for is when you do it at the device level, an enumeration of the internal port names. Not always do the port names look exactly as they would on the back of the system. So here you can see the different ports are brought in for your viewing, so you can ensure to do the appropriate monitors, versus at the dashboard level you would have to know the internal port names, and this low versus ETH0 and ETH1. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this view, but just wanted to point out that if you're ever in doubt, this is a good way to just first set up your monitors. If you're especially using a new custom object identifier, you can add them in here, do your test, and then have them built into the dashboard into a template. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about doing this in a template when you want to make a given profile for your systems. Maybe you have a Dell system and you want to do some RAID monitoring against that. How to do that in an onboarding scenario. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this down. We'll jump back over to the dashboard. And in the monitoring templates, you have the ability to manage a template. Let's say you have a series of given monitors you want to build out for Dell. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a server monitoring template. Actually, I need to remove this one because I already have one built out. We'll do something more interactive. So we'll call this Dell RAID monitoring. Maybe you manage primarily Dell systems. You can go in and you could build out your checks for each of the individual variables you want to look at. So SNMP check, we're going to first add the SNMP check for the first monitor, which is going to be the array manager, and then we're going to look at storage management. In this given scenario, let's say this were to be a Dell system locally. Well, we don't need to modify then any local host information. That should be fine. In most scenarios, it's going to be local host that you use versus loopback. Either way, it's going to be pointing at a local system, because when you're monitoring RAID against a Dell system, you need to be on the physical system where that RAID structure exists. So on that box, you'll have Open Manage installed. I do recommend versions 8 and later if you have access to that. And then you need to have the SNMP service installed as a localized service. Once you do that, let me jump over real fast. I want to point out something. Let's say this were to be Dell hardware. Under the Services Management Console, and a good tip for users that are on 2012 or later, you may need to set up to run the Services Management Console as admin, so you get view of all of the details that we're going to be focusing on. I'm going to just go ahead and we'll set it up for Services Management Console. You want to do a run as admin, and that allows you to see the security tabs and some of the more current systems. So when I view this, if I don't see the service called SNMP server service, I want to make sure that's installed. And that's again for monitoring your RAID structures on a Dell system. On HP, you need to have that as well. You just would need to have Insight Management versus the Open Manage. And then for your Lenovo systems, you would need to have the LSI Management Suite and the SNMP Server Service. So if you're not seeing that SNMP Server Service in here, you need to install that. And I'll give you a good resource on how to do that. You can find it on the web, tutorials for your operating system, but it's not the trap that you're looking for. It's actually a different service here. So I'm going to jump over real fast to the All Things Mac site. This is where sales engineers actively contribute. And what you're going to see is there's an article over here that talks about doing the Lenovo hardware monitoring. So it actually talks you through setting up the SNMP service. Definitely a good resource. I would recommend having that as your favorite. Monitoring, managing Lenovo servers with SNMP. And this goes through at least the concept of what you would need and adding this to the system. So it's actually under Add Features, Server Manager, Add Features in this given environment. And the SNMP service is primarily what you're looking for. That allows you to then bond with that application. In this given scenario, the LSI management suite is the application. In a Dell system, it would be the Open Manage. So we're going to jump over into my test machine. Let's go ahead and what we want to do is look at adding that feature. Sometimes it would require a restart of the system in order to do that. Most scenarios I've encountered does not, so we're going to try to do that now while we're in this session. And forgive my system, it's a little bit slow. This is a domain controller with 3 megs of memory, so it's a little bit delayed in response, but we'll get through what we need to. That way you have a good understanding of how to do that for the RAID monitoring as well. And if at any point you feel like you would like to have a one-on-one, one-on-many consultation experience going through your specific goals, you can always engage with your sales executive and ask for a tech walk. We can go over this material in a call. So right now what we're looking for is the SNMP server service. So add features, SNMP services, and this generally should take just a moment to actually get through the install, so fairly quick on any of your systems. This is really the only staging variable that would be needing to be configured. In most scenarios when I interact with customers that are setting this up, they already have their Open Manage applications, the Insight Management, those other application layers, so it's usually a very straightforward process. So once you go through and have this present on the system, and then you're just looking at the security variables under the properties and you're good to go. That way you can use that monitoring template that we're going to jump back to in just a moment. So here, let me see if we can do a refresh. Now keep in mind, I did load this as an administrator, and so when I go to the properties here, let's say we're on a 2012 system, I may not see just in the standard services management view the security tab. And so that is something that you want to keep in mind. I'm going to go through and we're going to try to reload this just so I have that present. So again, run as administrator. This is more what I'm speaking to now, going to be in a 2012 server system or later, where you're going to see the individual properties that you would need to set up. I think by default in your earlier systems, it's already going to be set up for you, allowing that local communication. But in this, you may have to go in and set an accepted community name, so read only. And in this, let's say we're going with public for a security review. I would say use something other than, maybe just set it up as organization, but it needs to match when you set it up in the dashboard. Just for demonstration, we're going to keep it at public, and then we accept it from localhost, so from itself. You could have it from anything on network. You could add your loop back in here as well, and to keep it more restricted. And that's just going to allow the query from the agent over to that given monitor. And then after doing that, maybe you want to quickly just restart that service, make sure it's up and running. And then back over to the dashboard where we were building out that template. Here, localhost define array manager. I'm going to use the defaults. Okay. And I'm building this out so I can assign it against many systems. If I wanted to add a few more, I have the ability to look at storage management. I have found with the Dell systems, Open Manage versions earlier than 8, So perhaps you're on 7. You may not have access to view. I believe it's either storage management or array manager. One of the two do not resolve, where if you're on 8 or later, you should be able to see both. So I would recommend, again, that being in place. And then the individual drives. Let's say you have 4 drives on each of your given system. What you want to do is start with a physical disk 1 in the list, moving down on this disk 1. And the reason you can build it out in a template and utilize it more efficiently is because you have 6 of these items grouped together. Maybe you want to do even more of those. And let's say you're managing 20 Dell systems. Instead of doing that individually at each system, what you have it is really built into a structural template, so you can just right-click and append that. So you save a lot of time just in the initial add, and also makes it easier for your technicians to come in and add that monitoring. Adds more value to you as a provider, even in that you're able to see if these drives are failing. So you can go in, get a new piece of hardware, do a hot swap, and let the RAID continue on, versus having to rebuild that entire structure. If you're just looking at the virtual drive at the front end, it sees it as one given entity, and so you're not going to see if the individual drives are having issue. This allows you to be more proactive and avoid those total outage scenarios. Now I've got the 4th disk in series, and I have a template. So all I'd have to do after staging one of my systems, I could come in and apply a monitoring template. I can do that at a higher structural level. I can do the same option of applying a template at a client or site level. So if I had a site of just Dell servers only, I could apply it. In this given scenario, though, we could just focus on having that locally. So the Dell RAID monitoring, and I'm going to just append it. I could do an append or a full override if that's the only kind of monitoring I wanted to have. But by doing this, this is going to add it to my existing monitors, and I would be able to get the individual resolve of each drive detail set. In this given scenario, I don't have a Dell piece of hardware, and this is actually a virtualized system. So this would come back with the details once it's applied with failures. So that's something to mention. You don't want to have, of course, early on failures. And unless it's a fault, something that you were not aware of, then you can go in and respond. So if you ever have it where it's failing there, make sure you review the other fundamentals that we talked about, the SNMP service on the system, and make sure maybe you have a walk utility on the device, and from the walk utility you can interact with that individual just as you would a network appliance. But with that, I've talked about what SNMP is in general, how it can be used in the dashboard, adding custom object identifiers, as well as mapping out those checks against the device, and more interactive viewing. Hopefully this has been really good material for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the floor back over to David and Robert to handle any questions. So I appreciate your time today. I wish you a wonderful week.
All right, thank you, Ernest. We're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the questions here, and take a moment here. Let me just. Well, I'm gonna leave this up, Ernest, so that if you were in answering any of the questions, if you want to refer to the actual dashboard, we can do that. All right, so let's take a look through here. First, I just did want to say, boy, I'll tell you, that is a great conversation to have with a customer, especially if you're getting somebody from break fix over to managed services, because that type of capability, I'm sure you've all had to rebuild machines before, especially that RAID array. I really wish I had that one client on there. It was heartbreaking to tell them the server was dead and to rely on tape backups to bring it back to life, where that really wasn't necessary. A simple alert would have solved the entire problem. So let's go ahead and look through some of these questions, and let's see what ones we can answer for you today. Is there an API available for this, Ernest?
So I would say yes, there is. We offer an API for the dashboard. If you look under our help files, under the integration section, you'll see the specifics around our API framework. What that allows you to do is see things such as a failing check. Keep in mind these are SNMP checks. So where you're looking at the given information, you're looking through an agent, and therefore if the device were to have a failure because of that check, it would feed into that view under the API and you could retrieve the information.
Excellent. All right, we have a question from Joshua asking what versions of SNMP are supported?
So the versions of SNMP that are supported are versions 1 and 2C, which are more your common standards, if you would, from appliances. In fact, some devices even use the 1 and 2 dictionaries. You'll even find in the mid-walk utility, when you load that up, it'll have those by default loaded. So those are the two, 1 and 2C.
Excellent. I have a question here from John. If the device I need to monitor is not on the platform, can I create it?
So if it is not on the platform, and by that I assume you mean not in the SNMP Checks list, you would be able to create that information set in your monitoring under the predefined SNMP Checks. Quite simply, you come in here and you add new, you put the vendor information, any details that you have, and save it. This is a focus on the individual object identifier versus the entire MIB structure. The MIB structure would be made up of object identifiers.
Excellent. All right, let's look through some of these other questions here.
So in the MIB files, they can't be loaded. The question is, can you demonstrate how MIB files are loaded? They cannot be loaded into the dashboard. You do not have the ability to come in here and load a MIB structure. You can plug in individual object identifiers, which are part of the MIB. From within a walk utility, my system was misbehaving this morning, so I can't go through it live. But what you would do is you would go under a MIB browser utility, and you would typically have a file load operation. You could load the MIBs. And once you load the MIBs, what it's going to do is it's going to populate into that browser utility all of the individual object identifiers. From there, you could do get operations with something like a double click, or you could do the get operations in the top right of a MIB walk if you're using like iReasoning or getIf. And from there, you could pull the value information from the individual entries. Once you have that object identifier focus, that's where you then jump back over to the dashboard and you plug it in under the predefined SNMP check.
Excellent. All right, I have another question here from Powell. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What if the agent fails or if the machine is offline, I assume, can we use multiple agents on the same site for SNMP monitoring?
So the answer is yes, you can use multiple, and I would suggest that if you have multiple server agents, assuming you're monitoring a remote appliance, having some sort of redundancy there. So what it would be is maybe you have two servers there, you could do cross checks in a sense. As a complement to that, I may even recommend, I don't know if all the users that are online have seen this, we've done some recent ads under site properties to include the overdue cross check. So you can even communicate with, if you're looking at a router, from outside the gates. So this is another form of redundancy where now you can receive the email alert if that's not accessible. So that would help you understand that the device is still offline. There's a network outage versus an individual agent failure.
Excellent, excellent. All right, I'm going to look through here. We have a few other questions I'm trying to go through. All right, from Joshua, would you clarify how would you get information for a network device without an agent?
So there is a requirement of having at least one agent on the network to do any of this. So in a given scenario where you want to monitor your network appliances and things like that, I would say have an agent installed on it. If you want, you can have a workstation operating system designated as a server agent, giving the ability to monitor the remote appliances as well as itself now. To install a server agent on a workstation platform, you use the interactive installer versus your silent installers seen under the site installation packages. And through the wizard, you would designate server agent. That would give you the ability to monitor multiple appliances on network, as well as you could do a network discovery. So in the future, as we grow out that feature set, you would be able to monitor through that given probe, if you would.
Excellent. And I think that also answers, we have Andrew's question, how can I have SNMP checks on a location that has no server? So I would assume then Ernest to do the same thing, that install an agent on a workstation that's up and use that as well, or can they use a workstation agent?
You do have the ability on a workstation agent to have SNMP checks added, but only against itself. So in a given scenario where, let's say, it had a RAID structure, you can monitor that, but you wouldn't be able to monitor the remote appliances. So in a given scenario that you want to monitor your routers, your printers, your switches, your NAS appliances, I would recommend either having a server operating system and install the agent, or install the agent interactively and designate a workstation operating system as a server agent.
Excellent. All right, let's see. We have quite a few questions coming in pretty fast, so let me see. Let's see here. Some of them are replies to questions that have already been out. See here. Here's a question. How difficult is it to get the MIB information from the manufacturers? Is that something that's readily available?
It depends. And what I've seen, vendors like Cisco, they do host the MIB browsers, or sorry, MIB dictionaries. So they would have like an individual FTP site, and they define what firmware the values will return upon. So in that regard, that seems to be a good vendor where you can get more, whereas other vendors out there I've seen, they don't provide a lot of the details. We may in the given scenario have that from other forums or some other definition, but it may be something where you need to do a little more web research to find the information set. There may be at times even where those pieces of hardware will return on the standard dictionaries, the 1 and 2 dictionaries. So just taking a MIB walk utility, you may be able to go in and determine like value information, things for like uptime, connection, variables, bandwidth, and so forth. So it is kind of a half and half. You may have some vendors that as a standard publicize a lot of that. You may have other ones that have it more close to the chest, if you would. You maybe have to contact them by phone or have some sort of package offering for support with them to be able to obtain that information. So there is no one rule to it.
Excellent. So we have another question here from Brad. He is asking basically if you already had a workstation installed, how would you convert that one over to a server? Would that require a reinstall of the RMM agent?
So unfortunately, there is no quick selection at the dashboard level to change a device type. So it would require, if you want to convert a workstation operating system to a server agent, that you uninstall the agent first and then use the interactive install.
And I have another question here. What is the agent iOS running on a virtual server? How do we monitor Hyper-V hosted hardware?
So I believe that was a typo in the question, but more or less it's asking how do you monitor those hardware entities such as RAID from a virtual appliance. That is really going to be not available for your RAID monitoring. You need to have it where the application and the hardware exists. So on the actual host entity itself, the physical device, is where you would want to do the monitoring. For the other appliances, though, things that are not localized, you would be able to monitor that through a virtual system.
Excellent. Let's see, a few more. We have a couple more minutes here for a few more of these questions. I'm kind of scanning through here. Flux capacitors fluxing.
It looks like a couple other of those are more comments and looking for something live, maybe in a walk utility and diving in more specifically. What I'd recommend doing, if there's still things that you'd like to see behind this, reach out to your sales executive and set up a one-on-one or one-to-many sales engineer tech walk where you can have your technicians on board. We can go through this, look and understand the environment that you're working with, and also help obtain the appropriate object identifier information for you. We can more facilitate that and make sure that you're being most effective with the monitoring here, where times it could be somewhat straightforward, and most often it is. Other times it may not be. So just getting on a call may be a good idea. Those are free, ongoing training sessions available to you as our customers.
Absolutely. Oh, I want to thank everyone for taking the time today. I'm sure you found a lot of value in this webinar, so keep your ears open for the next one in the series, and hoping you all get that shopping done and don't do anything too crazy over the holidays. So thank you again for joining us, and again, please, if you want more information, reach out, check out All Things Max, call your sales executive, get those tech walks set up, take advantage of that free training. Don't reinvent the wheel. But thank you all again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.